and restoration today. The last lecture for a while we'll spend in England. We're going to come back to England for the Industrial Revolution. But on Monday we're going to jump across the Atlantic to Jamestown, to Plymouth, and we're going to have ourselves a little American Revolution. So let's get into this. We left off last time with the death of the dictator, the death of the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell. Become more powerful than any monarch before him, ruled often without Parliament, dissolving it on multiple occasions when it did not do what he wanted it to do, and so he behaved very much like Charles. He taxed without consent of Parliament, the decimation tax. He did many things that Charles did before him. And in 1658, he dies. And we saw that in death, in his funeral, he did, or his effigy, did wear the royal crown. When he dies, his son, Richard, becomes Lord Protector. But Richard is no Oliver. Richard is weak and vacillating and doesn't have the background of Cromwell. Cromwell's legitimacy is derived from his military prowess. Richard doesn't have that. Richard is simply a great man's son. There's a third player in this drama. General Monk, the commander of the new model army. He recognizes very early on, in the winter of 1658 and into the spring of 1659, that everything is falling apart at the seams. When Cromwell died, he was not popular. The puritanical revolution that he attempted to impose upon the country was not popular. The closing of the theaters, the banning of gambling, the closing of the brothels and pubs, very unpopular with the majority of the English public. So Monk comes to the conclusion that there's only one man who can bring everyone together, who can put an end to the chaos following the death of Cromwell.
General Monk. It grieves me to find you in such a place, my lord. You should see Antwerp. This is what happens when the people lose respect for their leaders. If God had granted Cromwell another 10 years of life, the Republic would have been secure forever.
And if his mother had strangled him in the cradle, England would have been saved many years of misery and repression.
Cromwell's son cannot cling to power much longer. When he goes, this disorder will grow 100 times worse. Unless someone can be found to unite all parties in loyalty and obedience. I've come to the view that there is only one man alive with the status to perform such a task.
I'm guessing you mean either yourself or the king.
If I wanted the throne for myself, I would have left you here to rot undisturbed. I want you to write to the king in my name, telling him he must rule with Parliament or not at all. And what was done to his father must be forgiven. If he accepts these terms, he will have my allegiance.
Why should the king trust you? I will not lead him into a trap.
If a crown is the price of stable government, I am prepared to pay it.
Richard Cromwell has lost control. There is widespread unrest, and the London mob is demanding the return of their king.
Not long ago they wanted his death.
This is no time to dwell on the past. Buckingham writes that General Monk has rallied his army and is ready to demand a free Parliament. If we give him the encouragement he seeks, he will declare himself publicly for your restoration.
That is Charles Stuart's son, confusingly named Charles.
Buckingham even that.
Monk has a soldier of the old school. Whatever harm he's done, of course, in the past, I believe we can trust him now.
Ask his advice, even though we don't need it. Promise an amnesty, and make it clear that when I'm king, I'm making rich beyond anything he can dream of.
The very course of action I was about to suggest, Your Majesty.
Charles Stuart has declared that there will be no revenge taken on those who have opposed him. Our lives and our property will be safe. The army will receive its back pay in full, and a bill will be placed before this House promising freedom of worship to dissenters. He's also declared that the theatres will be reopened and music and dancing no longer forbidden. The time has come to heal our country's divisions. I call on this House to invite Charles Stuart to return to England as our king.
It's an amazing turnaround from 1649, when a small cabal put the king on trial, Charles I, and executed him on the 30th of January 1649 in front of his palace at Whitehall. His sons, plural, James and Charles, go into exile in Antwerp in Belgium. But Oliver Cromwell's son cannot maintain his grip on power. He's not his father. And the regime begins to crumble, so that General Monk decides the only person who can save England from anarchy is Charles Stuart. Charles Stuart, they executed, he's dead and buried. But his son, Charles Stuart, and he's invited by Parliament to return to England. And as he makes his way from Antwerp to England, he stops in the city of Breda on the continent and issues a declaration, creatively known as the Declaration of Breda. We do declare a free and general pardon to all our subjects, desiring and ordaining that henceforth all notes of discord, separation, and difference of parties be utterly abolished among all our subjects, for the resettlement of our just rights and theirs in a free parliament, by which we will be advised. And because the passion and uncharitableness of the times have produced several opinions in religion, we do declare a liberty to tender consciences, and that no man shall be disquieted or called in question for differences of opinion in matter of religion, which do not disturb the peace of the kingdom. One of the hallmarks of Cromwell's regime was religious toleration. And this was because of his religiosity. He was a Puritan, an independent, a seeker who believed that any established church violated the personal relationship that every person had with God. You had to find your own way to God. And so what Charles is doing here in the Declaration of Breda is trying to, on the one hand, keep this radical minority of Puritans who killed his father from going back into rebellion, but also assuring everyone that we are going to let bygones be bygones. Now, it is true when Charles returns that several of the people who signed his death warrant, who were still alive, were horribly tortured and executed. But by and large, he did let the past remain in the past. And in May of 1660, he arrives in London to a rapturous reception from the populace. Back in his palace at Whitehall, in front of which his father was executed.
Oh, continue.
Portrait of his father. Portrait of Cromwell being judiciously removed.
Will you leave me alone now?
The unthinkable has thus happened. The monarchy has been restored, and we've gone back to, or well, it seems as though we've gone back to a world before the Civil War. We're going to find that's not necessarily politically the case, but socially, the return of the king rolls back the Puritan attempts at social engineering. They had closed the theaters. Theaters are reopened. And for the first time ever, women appear on stage. During Shakespeare's time, all the female parts have been played by boys. Now, women will take the stage. Gambling is reintroduced. The English love to gamble. It's been prohibited by Cromwell's Puritan regime. And perhaps most importantly for the English men and women, the pubs are reopened. They've been closed by the Puritan regime, which was attempting to make a new Jerusalem in England, a godly country. And so, almost overnight, relatively speaking, things change radically in England with the return of the Stuart monarchy. But there's something relatively new as well in society. And it's all because of this thing. What is that thing? That is a coffee bean. Restoration society is fundamentally different from society before the Civil War because of the coffee house. It's true that the first coffee house does open under Cromwell's protectorate in 1652 in London. Puritans saw coffee as an alternative to intoxicating beverages, but it's during the reign of Charles II that coffee houses explode on the scene. By the turn of the 18th century, there are 500 or so coffee houses in London. And if you haven't done so, do take some time to read the article from The Economist in 2003. It's quite interesting, and it makes a parallel between the second half of the 17th century and the turn of the 21st century. And it argues that just as the internet has created a realm of public discourse unseen before the time of the internet, the coffee house does the same. And the title, Internet in a Cup, is a reference to what you can get at a coffee house besides coffee. And that's news. Newspapers, though they exist prior to the coffee houses, are a small phenomenon. With the coffee houses, they have a place to be distributed. The printing press allows you to make hundreds of copies a day. No, maybe not hundreds. Lots and lots of copies a day. But not enough to send it to people's houses. That's going to take the Industrial Revolution and steam engines and steam-powered presses. But you can make 100 or so. And on a daily or weekly basis, in the coffee houses, the newspapers arrive. There are dozens of different publications, like the London Gazette, this one from December 1674, the London Intelligencer. There are dozens of newspapers and newsletters. And so in the coffee house, you not only get coffee, but you are plugged into a world of public discourse that did not exist prior to the coffee houses. And it's in these coffee houses that the great issues of the day will be debated and read about. And there is no issue that looms larger in Restoration England than the succession. Who will succeed Charles II? He has no legitimate children. He's got a lot of illegitimate children from his mistresses, but no legitimate children. Who will succeed? There's really only one legal possibility, and that is his brother, James, the Duke of York. You may say, well, that sounds fine. Younger brother succeeding the older brother? Sure. Well, it's not that simple, because James has converted to the religion of his mother. James is a Catholic in a country that is 98% Protestant and virulently anti-Catholic. Between 1679 and 1681, the so-called exclusion crisis will divide the country and divide Parliament into two factions. On the one hand, you have the Whigs, who argue that one of Charles's Protestant illegitimate sons should be king. Their opponents are the Tories, conservative monarchists, royalists, who, though they would prefer James not be a Catholic, nonetheless are willing to defend his right to the throne. That he is God's ordained, and though it would be better if he wasn't Catholic, he is the rightful heir. And this dominates the public discourse in 1679, 80, and 81. In 1681, King Charles II makes a bold move to end the debate.
What if the king needs to fight as his father did?
He has too much intelligence and too few principles for that. And unlike his father, he knows when a battle is lost.
of the exclusion of the Duke of York from the rightful succession is treason. Any who speak of it set themselves against legitimate authority and are the heirs in spirit to those rebels who so recently plunged our country into rebellion and civil war. Can anyone here contemplate such evil without horror? Let there be no confusion. The Duke of York is my heir and will remain so. His right is ordained by God, and no man may alter it. Anyone who denies this truth makes themselves an enemy of God, king, and country. Think on that before you take another step towards chaos. All the world may see what a point we have come to. Nothing that begins in such division is likely to end well. I declare Parliament dissolved. Gentlemen, go home. I will not trouble you any further.
Dissolved by the king. The exclusion crisis, while it ends in defeat of the Whigs, will give us political parties moving forward. In fact, to this day, the Conservative Party in England is known as the Tories. As you can see up there, King Charles II, 1630 to 85, within 4 years of this proroguing of Parliament, the king is dead. And his brother, James Stuart, Duke of York, becomes King James II. And so a century that began with James I, we now have James II. James I, Charles I, Charles II, James II. A nice little mirror image on either side of the Civil War. So let's meet King James II.
17th century England, Scotland and Wales were overwhelmingly Protestant. Less than 2% of the population was Catholic. But in 1685, that tiny minority began to have greater and greater influence thanks to the new king and Catholic convert, James II. James was a brave but humorless character. The Scots nicknamed him Dismal Jimmy. He came to the throne in his early 50s and zealously promoted his newfound Catholicism.
Britain's Protestants became increasingly alarmed at their new king. In their minds, Catholicism meant one thing: domination by a foreign pope and all the Catholic powers of Europe. To them, there was no doubt. A Catholic king was a danger to the British Protestant way of life.
At his residence here at the Palace of Whitehall, James was unperturbed. He continued to advance Catholicism with scant regard for the consequences.
There was one thing that made James bearable to his Protestant subjects. He was getting old, and he had no male heir. On his death, the crown would pass to his eldest daughter, Mary, who was still a Protestant. People were ready to wait it out. and see the throne revert to Mary and Protestantism when James finally died. But then, in 1688, James announced a bombshell. His wife was pregnant.
Do you believe in the Holy Spirit and the Catholic Church and the union of saints and the gift?
The baby was a boy. James had a male heir.
Everything had changed. Protestant hopes of seeing Mary on the throne were shattered. And when they heard that the baby had been baptized and the Pope himself was his godfather, they knew that their future king would be raised a Catholic.
I baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son.
In June 1688, 7 Protestant politicians sent a letter appealing to James's daughter Mary and her powerful husband, William, Prince of Orange, the champion of Protestant Europe.
William was a 38-year-old Dutchman. He was hunchbacked, pockmarked, and asthmatic. But he was a respected and popular military commander. The English invited William to intervene to stem the growth of Catholic power.
He jumped at the chance, and on November the 5th, 1688, he landed at Torbay in Devon with a force of 10,000 men, and he headed for London.
Hundreds of soldiers from James's army began to defect and declared their allegiance to William.
Almost overnight, James's rule collapsed. With many of his troops defecting, he took to his heels and fled. Parliament declared that he abdicated and that his daughter, Mary, William's wife, should be queen. But this wasn't enough for William. He demanded the throne for himself, and he was offered it in this very room. 2 months later, William and Mary were crowned king and queen. The Protestants' coup d'etat had triumphed, or so it seemed.
But James wasn't finished. He fled to France, to the protection of the man who represented everything William hated, the most powerful man in Europe, the French and very Catholic King Louis XIV.
With Louis's backing, James believed he would have all the men and money he needed to recover his crown and revive Catholic hopes. The tug of war for the throne was about to begin. But the battlefield would not be in England, it would be in Ireland.
Within 18 months, a battle between the armies of 2 men who'd been crowned king, James and William, would end in a bloody climax on an Irish hillside.
So we have a remarkable series of events here. It's what the English call the Glorious Revolution, the final triumph of Protestantism over Catholicism. It's a largely bloodless revolution, at least initially. Most of James's army refuses to fight for him because they're all Protestants. And so he flees into the arms of the most powerful monarch in Europe. Man will meet after the first exam, King Louis XIV of France, an extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily Catholic king. Louis will finance a return expedition by James in 1690 that will end up in Ireland and will end on the Boyne River in Ireland. James has a large army, but it's ill-trained. Louis is not willing to give him his own soldiers. He does send some cavalry, but most of James's military are Irish Catholic peasants. William, on the other hand, arrives with a disciplined force of Dutch and continental Protestants, and they destroy James's attempt to recapture his throne. He returns to France and will live out the rest of his days in exile. The year before this climactic battle, back in London, in order for William and Mary to be given the throne, Protestant parliamentarians drafted an act declaring the rights and liberties of the subject and settling the succession of the crown, better known as the so-called English Bill of Rights. So take out your 2-page English Bill of Rights, and with your partner, with the people around you, discuss what are the crimes of James II, what are the rights of Parliament and the rights of subjects. Talk it out. You got to talk. Talking is an important part of it. And vocalizing and understanding. It's hard. Parliament James II England and Ireland, which is Catholic. Prepared to raise an army there, and the goal is to then get over to England and march on London. But William arrives and settles there and crushes his army and takes way back. All right, you ready to discuss the English Bill of Rights? Technical title: an act declaring the rights and liberties of the subject and settling the succession of the crown. So let's go through this point by point. This is a multi-layered document. On the one hand, it's laying out the things that James has done. But it also lays out Parliament's rights and, as the actual title, the liberties of the subject. So let's start with James. What has James done to provoke the ire of Englishmen? What's one thing?
He raised an army without.
Okay, so what number is that?
4.
Number 4. By raising and keeping a standing army within this kingdom in time of peace, without consent of Parliament, and quartering soldiers, contrary to law. What does quartering soldiers mean? Yes, sir.
Like, soldiers can spend the night in somebody's house without their permission.
Yeah, billeting in private homes. This will come up again when we get to America. So that's one thing he's done. What else has he done? Yes?
He's trying to raise money by other means other than consent.
Okay, so where do you see that?
Number 3.
Number 3, by levying money, as say taxation, for the use of the crown by prerogative other than the same that was granted by Parliament. Parliament holds the purse strings. This was the same thing that got Charles I in trouble with ship money back in the 1630s, trying to tax without parliamentary consent. In short, taxation without representation. What else has James done wrong? Yes, sir.
The first one, at least that I interpreted, was saying that he's putting people in charge that are anti-Protestant.
Yeah, number 1. First charge, and if it's number 1, it probably means it's the thing that's most important. King James II, by the assistance of diverse evil counselors, judges, and ministers, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the Protestant religion. What's extirpate mean? Eradicate, get rid of, annihilate. He's anti-Protestant. He is trying to reintroduce that evil Catholicism into the realm. What else has he done? Yes, sir.
Pass laws not to be sent to Parliament.
All right, where do you see that? Number 2. By assuming and exercising the power of dispensing and suspending laws and the execution of laws without Parliament. He's putting himself above the law. He is circumventing and abrogating parliamentary statutes by fiat, by prerogative, by royal prerogative. Has he done anything else wrong?
Impose excessive bail, excessive fines.
Yes, number 9, 10, 11, a nice troika that we will see again when we get to America. Excessive bail hath been required. Excessive fines have been imposed. And illegal and cruel punishments inflicted. We will see all 3 of those again in America. What about number 5? Yes, sir.
He's disarming Protestants.
Yes, and at the same time arming Papists, that is to say Catholics. The English like using adjectival forms of the word pope to describe Catholics. You see Papist, you see popery, popish. It's a particularly English thing. So he's arming the Papists and disarming the Protestants. So James has done a lot wrong here in the first 13 articles. Then you get to 14, which is where the rubber meets the road, it says that James has abdicated, and the throne's now open, so we can give it to somebody. Then 15 begins really the third part of this text, which is, as it says in 15, asserting ancient rights and liberties declared. The Lords, spiritual and temporal, that is to say, the House of Lords and the Commons do declare Articles 16 to 25. So what do we have here in 16 to 25? What are the rights of Parliament? What's a right of Parliament? Yes?
Make laws.
Make laws. Where do you see that? Number 16. These are phrased in a bit of an odd way. It's very 17th century phrasing. The second clause, without the consent of Parliament, is illegal. Refers to first, is that the pretended power of suspending laws or the execution of laws by legal authority without the consent of Parliament is illegal. This is a direct reference to number 2, that James was suspending laws without parliamentary consent. It's essentially rephrasing and therefore emphasizing. So, suspending laws without consent of Parliament is illegal. What about money? What about taxation?
Only Parliament tax.
What number is that? Number 18. That levying money for the use of the crown by pretense of prerogative without grant of Parliament, etc., is illegal. The king cannot tax, only Parliament can tax. What about 19? Can I complain to the king? Yes, I can. That it is the right of the subjects to petition the king, and all commitments and prosecutions for such petitioning are illegal. What about 23? Free speech in Parliament. To this day, England has very, very severe libel laws. A lot of things that get said in political campaigns in this country would get you arrested for libel in England. But in Parliament, there is freedom of speech. They're inching towards democratic government. It's going to be a slow process here in England, but this is really a foundational document. Along with the instrument of government from 1653, they're moving away from monarchy and slowly towards democratic government. It takes time. The king is still very powerful here at the turn of the 18th century. Parliament is still an advisory body, but as the 18th century progresses, the prime ministers will become increasingly powerful. So by the time you get to the 19th century, Queen Victoria is becoming a figurehead. It's really Parliament that becomes the true source of power and is a freestanding body, not something that's called into existence or dissolved by the king. And we see that then in the very last article, 25. That for redress of grievances and for amending, strengthening, and preserving the laws, parliaments ought to be held frequently. It doesn't say how frequently, but they're getting towards a kind of separation. Parliament in its original form is an advisory body for the king. It's kind of like the president's cabinet. But it's moving towards a separate legislative body. It's going to be a slow process, but it has its roots here. And as you can see in this document, our own American Revolution drew quite heavily on not only this, but also on a great political philosopher, John Locke. Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Ben Franklin, James Madison, all thoroughly Lockean in their political philosophy. In 1690, the same year as the battle of Boyne, John Locke wrote a kind of ex post facto justification for the overthrow of James II, the second treatise on government. And we've got one excerpt from one chapter here, the chapter on tyranny, chapter 18. This is a foundational document for our own revolution. It argues that kings are beholden to the law. They are not above the law. And that if they put themselves above the law, then they are no longer a legitimate monarch. They are a tyrant. And a tyrant can be morally and legally opposed. This is the justification. Locke's theory will be employed, as we're going to see on Monday, in the 1770s in America, when people like Jefferson argue that the King George III has become a tyrant because he has superseded the laws of the colonies. Thus, he can be justly rebelled against. So, without 17th century England, America probably doesn't exist. Without the experience of the Civil War and the Puritan Revolution and then the Glorious Revolution, it's difficult to see how our own revolution would have happened or happened in the same manner. We have foundational documents whose echoes are going to be very, very clearly seen in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. This English Bill of Rights, this second treatise on government, and looking back even further, the instrument of government are foundational. So, we've had a tumultuous half-century here in England. Beginning with the Battle of Naseby in 1645, the Battle of Preston, 1648. The Royalist cause is defeated, and Charles ends up in parliamentary custody. However, things become radicalized because that army that defeated King Charles I is a fairly radical body comprised of independents, of Puritans, of political radicals, who in 1648, in December, execute a military coup d'etat. They remove 150 members, Presbyterian members, moderate members from Parliament, leaving 50 like-minded Puritans, the so-called rump. And it will be the rump that in January of 1649, just a month after the coup, will put Charles on trial for high treason, convict him, and execute him on January 30th in front of his palace of Whitehall. Thus begins the 11-year period of republic, the only period without a monarch in English history. But it's an unusual kind of republic. It's closer to a dictatorship than it is to a republic, because Cromwell, in many ways, behaves the same way that Charles did. When Parliament doesn't do what he wants, he dissolves it multiple times. He taxes without parliamentary consent with the decimation tax, and is very much a monarch in name only. After his death, the unpopularity of his regime cannot survive, and his son cannot hold on to power. And in 1660, General Monk leads the charge to restore the monarchy, to invite Charles II to return from Antwerp and become king. The problem is Charles II has no legitimate son. And so an exclusion crisis happens because his brother, James, is a convert to Catholicism, adopting the religion of his mother, Henriette Marie. In 1685, when Charles dies without legitimate children, his brother becomes James II. Things come to a head in 1688 because his wife gives birth to a son whose godfather is none other than the Pope in Rome. This causes panic in England. Protestant members of Parliament send a letter to William, James's son-in-law, asking him to invade and save them from this Catholic menace, which he does. James flees, and the Glorious Revolution happens with very little bloodshed. However, in 1690, in Ireland, James will attempt to regain his throne, invading with the help of money from Louis XIV, but he will be defeated at the Boyne River by William and his Dutch military. The year before, Accession of the Crown, a foundational document for our own democracy. So, when we come back on Monday, we will have an American Revolution. We will begin at Jamestown and Plymouth, and we will end with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. You have two pieces of very important primary source evidence: the Declaration of Rights and Grievances and the Declaration of Independence. Print those, bring them with you. Bring also the English Bill of Rights, because we will do some comparing and contrasting, seeing the similarities between these documents a century apart. So have a nice weekend. Enjoy Austin Peay.